I'm Karim. I direct the Center for Islamic Arabic Studies, and I teach in the Political Science Department here.
I'm David Johns, retired from the Political Science Department with a focus on global systems.
I'm Karim, Bejjit from Morocco, Hassan University, and I'm on visiting Fulbright grant, and I'll be happy to present today.
I am Ann Johns, ostensibly retired from San Diego State.
I'm Erika Choi, and I lead the linguistics department.
That's it.
Yeah, I'm one of these.
Each person should
Don't forget the important stuff.
I'm retired from San Diego State U Library for 42.5 years. Wow. It's hard to find some of these buildings because this used to be the home economics department building, and now look at it.
I'm Ann Donaday. I teach here and I do research on Francophone Algerian writers, North African writers.
In what department? European Studies and Women's Studies. I'm actually chair of the Department of European Studies.
Very good. 1970 graduate, 83 masters in education, retired math teacher from San Diego Unified District.
Back there, no? Oh, okay. You want to be invisible? Okay.
I'm Shabnam Isner. I'm a psychology major here, and I'm taking a class with Professor Campbell, which is an outstanding student.
Very good.
No, you changed it.
Ahmet Kuru, Political Science, studying Islam, Democracy and Secularism.
Rad Osman, linguistics and Asian African languages, also affiliated with the Center for Islamic Arabic Studies. Sandra Campbell, History Department, Early Islamic Historical Moment.
All right. So now we can start.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Let me introduce
Yes,
you.
go ahead. Sure. I thought.
Yeah. So are we starting now, David? Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming here. I'd like to welcome you to this presentation by Professor Karim Bejjit, who's Associate Professor at the English Department of Hassan II University in Casablanca, Morocco. Professor Bejjit is here visiting on a Fulbright Fellowship, and this is his 4th month. It's been a pleasure to have him here, and the topic of his presentation is Refashioning Barbary, American Discourse on North Africa. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. Well, I think I prefer to stand. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for accepting to come to my talk. I hope you wouldn't be disappointed. Before I start, I would like to thank a few people who really helped me first to come here and then to be settled and to make some good progress in my project. First of all, I'd like to thank Eniko Chumay, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, for encouraging me to come to San Diego because I had other plans, and I discovered that I made the right decision by coming here. I am happy that I have achieved so much. I didn't even imagine I would do that much. So thank you, and thank you for your family. I'd like to thank Farid and Ghada for being such nice friends and such challenging intellectual voices here representing other communities out there. And I would like to thank David and Anne for hosting me and for being nice friends. And I hope this is just the beginning of our friendship. Of course, I would like to thank 2 special people here. My landlady, who opened her house for me, and she's, she said, a librarian. She served in this library, so that in itself is a great achievement. And
sorry you're going.
Oh, maybe I'll come another time.
Yes.
And of course, David, Larry Good, for helping me from the very beginning without even knowing me or having heard about me. So we got in touch, and he provided so much information about San Diego. I'd never visited San Diego before, and so he was helpful. And thanks to you, you made my stay from the very beginning, an occasion of knowing more about the city and the state. And I'm happy that I had the chance to know you and to know your family. So as you can see, I mean, I've been very much pampered by all these people here, and I go home with lots of good memories. Today is like I'm presenting every day. My presentation is part of a project that I tried to develop. There are two projects that I worked on. One in a state of completion, I should say, and it's been taking years, and I'm glad I achieved so much, and I worked most of the time on it, to be frank with you. And the other one is this that I'm presenting, and I had the chance to explore a great deal of materials, and I'm going with other plans to expand some of the basic ideas that I had because of lack of access of books, and so it's also part of the course that I teach back home. So, you know, I collected a great deal of materials, and I took notes, and some of the things that I developed I would like to share with you, knowing that I'm not an expert yet on this subject. I hope maybe in the next 3-4 years I would be more knowledgeable about this. So my topic is about American discourse on North Africa back to the late 18th century and early 19th century, but it also relates to the present. And for the sake of time, I have put some of those thoughts on paper, and I'd like to read to you, if you can bear with me. So I'd like to begin with an interesting passage from Edward Said's Orientalism, towards the end of the book, Orientalism. Edward Said says, American contribution to the history of Orientalism can be dated roughly from the period immediately following World War II, when the United States found itself in the position recently vacated by Britain and France. The American experience of the Orient prior to that exceptional moment was limited. Cultural isolators like Melville were interested in it. Cynics like Mark Twain visited and wrote about it. The American transcendentalists saw affinities between the Indian thought and their own. A few theologians and biblical students studied the biblical Oriental languages. There were occasional diplomatic and military encounters with the Barbary pirates, he calls them, and the like, the odd naval expeditions to the far Orient, and of course, the ubiquitous missionary to the Orient. But there was no deeply invested tradition of Orientalism. The imaginative investment was never made, perhaps because the American frontier, the one that counted, was the westward one. End of quote. The gist of Said's argument is that American interest in the Orient came rather belatedly and was shaped by geopolitical and economic factors. Unlike European Orientalist tradition based on philology, literature, and the study of Islamic cultures, American Orientalism is informed by pragmatic principles. Its practitioners belong to a new generation of scholars trained in modern social sciences and operate under the auspices of corporate, educational, and administrative institutions. There is little in earlier periods, we are told, that matches this vigorous American engagement with the Orient, or the Middle East, as it has been called in recent decades. The Barbary Wars episode was a thing of the past and had only an ephemeral effect on American thought. These neat formulations and juxtapositions leave out a considerable amount of interesting detail. It is ironical that Said, who was a tireless critic of stereotype and uncritical thinking, should use the phrase, quote, Barbary pirates, oblivious of the immense prejudice and inaccuracy which it contains. Said pays only lip service to the American encounter with so-called Barbary states. But then, has he not systematically shunned this part of the Muslim world and refrained from engaging in any discussion of European discourse on North Africa? The only reference that one comes across in the book, Orientalism, comes from George Orwell's essay, Marrakesh, and is explored in a broad sense. Said claims that Orientalism was premised on the idea that the East was inherently a passive and silent other. But then how does one account for the cultural dynamics which the Andalusian model represented, whose durability and far-reaching intellectual impact in Europe was acknowledged even by Orientalists themselves. Why is there such a consistent oversight in Said's books of such North African luminaries as Sharif al-Idrisi, Ibn Battuta, Ibn Khaldun, and Hassan ibn Wazan, better known as Leo the African, whose original works brought Europeans closer to the vast terra incognita that lay beyond the Mediterranean shores? Was it not the centuries-long clashes between North Africans and Iberians that shaped Europe's antagonistic notions of Islam? Did Iberian global imperial reach not begin with the occupation of strategic outposts along the Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts of Morocco? Was it not the naval warfare tactics which North African corsairs used against expanding European trade in the Mediterranean and beyond since the mid-16th century that had gained North African cities, Salé, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli the notorious reputation of being nests of pirates and the present houses of thousands of white Christian captives? There is a whole body of captivity literature dating back to the early 17th century that had contributed to the perception of North Africans as uncivilized and fanatical population ruled by brutal despots. It is no coincidence that one of the foundational fictional narratives in English, Robinson Crusoe, should contain an episode of captivity endured by Crusoe in Salé, reminiscent of the Algerian experience described by Cervantes in Don Quixote. Unlike Said, I believe that American earlier turbulent contact with North Africa was, in fact, a defining moment for both the nascent American nation and the old regimes of North Africa. The encounter, indeed, was a clumsy and disorderly affair. As it unfolded, it reflected more anxiety and bewilderment on the part of the American political elite than a sense of firm vocation or imperial mission. Nevertheless, it does not require too much digging into the archives to note how the trauma of the Barbary episode, which Said dismisses as inconsequential, had shaped early American awareness of Islam and supplied a whole repertory of images of Muslims that continue to the present. 2 centuries later, following the tragic incident of September 11, and in a desperate attempt to explain what was taking place, a number of American historians precipitately turned to the past, particularly to the Barbary Wars episode, and rather naively, one should add, identified what they thought were precedents of the current situation. There were lessons to be drawn from the past, they argued. Americans had faced similar challenges from Muslim states before and learned in due time that it was only through military action that America's rights and interests could be made respected. Terrorism and corsairs activities, they asserted, were fundamentally similar, being the expression of Muslim jihad against the Christian world and Western values, for, they would continue, for there was an inveterate and undying aversion to the values of Western of freedom and democracy inherent in the culture of Islam, which fomented anger and hatred for the West. You hear that a lot, especially during earlier years, but to some extent even at the present. Just as Barbary pirates attacked American trading vessels, appropriated their cargoes and enslaved their crews or held them for ransom in the name of Islam, so too fanatical and extreme Muslim individuals indoctrinated by jihadist propaganda have wrought havoc and destruction on thousands of peaceful civilians across the world. This analogy is not only false and dangerous, but it also provides a vulgar example of politicized and biased scholarship. In drawing attention to the polemical tenor and strong rhetoric which inform American publications on North Africa, this talk identifies or tries to identify the broad lineaments of American historical discourse. With a few significant exceptions, the dominant tendency in American historiography from Alan Gardner's classic, Our Navy and the Barbary Corsairs, 1905, to recent publication, and for the sake of example, I choose Philip Blake, recent book, Our Pirate War, How the U.S. and its Navy Defeated Pirate Bands of North Africa. You know, all types of titles. If you just type Barbary corsairs or pirates, rather pirates, then you get, so many books coming out. So the dominant tendency in this historiography has been to reconstruct American encounter with North Africa in triumphalist terms, and that's probably the most important aspect of this recent historiography. It must be considered, however, that nearly all historical studies dealing with the so-called Barbary Wars were and continue to be written by American authors. My laborious researches for counter-narratives written by North Africans have yielded meager results. This episode of pre-colonial Maghreb seems to be superseded and overshadowed by more dramatic experiences of modern European colonialism, which have had lasting political, cultural, economic, and social impact on North African populations. But apart from the fact that American historians have been our principal source of information about the Barbary Wars, archival materials on which these historians have drawn consist exclusively of American sources. Official correspondence, parliamentary papers, political speeches, diaries, captivity narratives, newspaper articles, etc. While these American records contain rich and detailed information on the various dramatic incidents which took place in Algiers and Tripoli between 1785 and 1815, there is simply very little that can challenge the exceedingly monolingual voice of the American narrative. Now, probably many of you don't have an idea about what happened between 1784 and 1850. And I thought I should just present a short narrative of the incident. For those of you who already know this, it might be a little bit boring to hear the rest, the detail. How did the U.S. came into conflict with North African states? Until September 1783, when Britain officially recognized the independence of its rebellious colonies in North America, American sailors had carried British passes and enjoyed the protection which current treaties with North African states guaranteed. In the absence of a recognized international maritime code, countries then were constrained to conclude bilateral treaties which were renewed according to terms negotiated and agreed by both parties. In 1785, following the conclusion of peace treaty between Algiers and Spain, Algerian corsairs were free to cruise the seas beyond the straits. In July, they seized two small American vessels, Maria and the Dauphin. Their total crew amounted to 21 sailors. What made matters worse was the reluctance of European powers to support American interest in this particular part of the world. Congress had appointed a peace committee consisting of Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson to solicit the three European countries with which they then had formal diplomatic relations, namely France, Britain, and the Netherlands, to extend their protection to American ships trading in the Mediterranean. As these propositions failed to elicit a favorable response from European powers, Congress was compelled to rely on its own means. It must be remembered that in 1785, the United States was a fragile confederation of only 13 states, without a president, a formal constitution, or a powerful federal government. They lacked a navy, and the treasury was in shambles. Some of you might say, what's new? Are you talking about the president?
Our navy's doing it.
We've got a navy.
Yeah. Moreover, American diplomats had scant knowledge of North African nations and were not fully qualified or empowered to conduct successful diplomatic negotiations with Muslim rulers. The first American envoy to Algiers, a certain John Lamb, arrived in March 1786. Given his lack of experience in diplomatic affairs and limited negotiation powers, he failed to make a favorable impression on the Dey of Algiers or bring him to sign a peace treaty. On the question of ransom of American captives, Lamb had equally little success. After protracted negotiations with the Dey, he agreed to a deal of $48,300. Which was beyond what he was authorized to pay. Months after his departure, there was no news about the promised ransom money. Congress refrained from endorsing Lamb's agreement, and the 21 American captives were left to face their own destiny. Those who survived seasons of plagues, poor nutrition, and hard labor had to wait for 11 years before they could see their homeland again. Ironically, it was this first group of American captives that supplied the future U.S. consuls in North Africa. Of these men, Captain Richard O'Brien and James Linder Cathcart were to become consuls of Algiers and Tripoli, respectively. Meanwhile, in December 1793, the situation became aggravated as over 100 more American sailors had been captured by Algerian corsairs. This was a severe blow to the American government and provoked immediate indignation among the political elite in the United States. It was in response to this new dramatic development that Congress voted $1 million for the construction of 6 frigates, despite considerable opposition from Congress members pertaining to the enormous cost of building and maintaining a naval force and its efficiency in protecting American trade and shipping in the Mediterranean. President George Washington, who approved the Congress bill to build the frigates, was convinced that the diplomatic option might still yield better results, as it did with Morocco. And I omitted the case of Morocco because there were no complications to relation between Morocco and the U.S., and it took only less than 6 months to come to a deal, and it's considered one of the oldest treaties between the United States and a foreign country. And actually, Moroccans are always boasting that they were the first to recognize American independence. Whatever. So President George Washington, who approved the Congress bill to build the frigates, was convinced that diplomatic option might still yield better results and lead to a durable peace treaty such as the one concluded with the Sultan of Morocco. In subsequent months, thanks to a flurry of diplomatic activity and a voluminous body of correspondence between various American agents in the Mediterranean, a breakthrough in the negotiation with the Dey of Algiers was achieved, albeit at a high cost to the American government. In exchange of peace, the government of Algiers received a total of $1 million, comprising ransom money, naval stores, and presents for the Dey and various officials. If this diplomatic encounter had finally brought the plight of American captives to a happy end, it was also a painful reminder that the United States was ill prepared to face so distant and unconventional enemy as Algiers. In July 1796, American captives sailed from Algiers. They were now free citizens again, but their experience of captivity were not easily forgotten. In their memoirs and narratives, the sense of lingering trauma and pain is overpowering. The story of how they fared all these years in a distant alien territory is compelling and has been told many times, most sympathetically by H.G. Barnaby in his book, The Prisoners of Algiers, which came out in 1966. It will come as a surprise to the reader of Barnaby's account that American captives enjoyed relative freedom and were not subjected to physical torture and oppression so often associated with Barbary prisons. American captives, for instance, were not forced to abandon their faith or renounce their countries. While they were forced to work, they were not chained or incarcerated. They were free to meet, frequent taverns, and correspond with their families. Those who had the appropriate skills or possessed enough money to bribe their way were far better off than the rest of their fellow countrymen. James Cathcart, who later became consul of Tripoli, or American consul in Tripoli, was astute enough to understand the power structure and social dynamics of Algiers and grew to become the Dey's chief Christian secretary and owner of 7 taverns and a ship of nearly 200 tons. Native. What Barnaby's account imparts to us is a clear and well-documented argument that American captives were held in subjugation, not so much because they were the enemy or that they happened to embrace a different religion, but essentially because they were a valuable source of revenue. The religious element, which recent accounts of the Barbary episode have stressed beyond all factors, is repudiated by the fact that corsairing was as much a North African practice as it was a European one. For centuries, European sailors served on board Barbary ships and reveled in their bold forays against European shipping. Their service in the Barbary navies had drawn severe criticism from European historians and earned them the notorious title of renegades. Besides European sailors, Jewish traders who had settled in North African ports since the end of the 15th century took an active part in the corsair industry, a part that is rarely acknowledged in European historiography and American historiography for that matter. In his narrative, Barnaby notes that a considerable Jewish community lived in Algiers and that the most powerful banking institution which the Algerian government depended on was controlled by a Jewish family by the name of Barbary. The prolonged captivity of American sailors in Algiers and the dilemma which the government faced in reacting to the Algerian affront received considerable coverage in local newspapers in Boston and Philadelphia. Polemicists, moralists, and poets drew cultural contrasts between the United States and Algiers, contrast of which race and religion formed the essence. Even without an actual war being waged, the crisis with Algiers had crystallized a nationalist sentiment and opened up a space for Americans to reflect and valorize the very ideals and principles on which their nation was built. In contemporary narratives written by American captives, the experience of servitude in Algiers has far more human overtones. Both James Cathcart and John Foss describe vivid scenes of personal endurance as they try to come to terms with their new reality. Their tales of survival amid an alien and unsympathetic community, fraught with prejudice as they are, reflect the traumas of encountering a different and challenging social and cultural order. Unlike Foss' anecdotal comments on Algerian customs, Cathcart's reflection on Algerian political establishment reveal a mixture of fascination and revulsion, and highlight the archaic power structure and despotism of Algerian rulers with whom he becomes closely associated. In both narratives, however, the question of freedom assumes both personal and philosophical dimensions. Captivity in Algiers is seen as an emblem of the life of bondage to which the Algerian natives themselves are reduced. There is a degree of gratification and solace derived from what is perceived as an inescapable comparison between the life of servitude in Algiers and the freedom enjoyed at home. Assertive analogies such as this were not restricted to the captives. The realm of Barbary, which had hitherto been unknown to Americans, became a familiar space in the popular imagination in the mid-1790s. Identified as hostile and barbarous, where brutal tyrants lorded it over impoverished, ignorant, and fanatical populations, and where women dwelled in seraglios and lived at the mercy and whim of lusty Moor or Turk. The most powerful literary expressions of these metaphors of captivity can be found in an early American play by Susanna Rawson, titled Slaves in Algiers, A Struggle for Freedom, 1794. The play, which was staged in Baltimore and Boston, draws on the experiences of American captives and dramatizes the climactic moment of escape in which both female and male captives combine efforts to throw off the yoke of the Algerian potentate. In their passionate endeavor to attain freedom, male captives are brought to recognize the genuine merits of their female comrades beyond their traditional romantic and docile postures. Feminist critics today have argued that Rawson's play was as much a rallying cry against Algerian despotism, cruelty, and greed as a championing of the women's cause and their aspiration for emancipation. Women, quote from Rawson's epilogue, women were born for universal sway, men to adore, be silent, and obey. A wise saying, isn't it? Beside Rawson's play, Royal Tyler's novel, The Algerian Captive, 1797, also offers a remarkable literary exploration of the theme of slavery in Barbary. Much like Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, Tyler's novel tells the story of Updike Underhill, who, after a long and indulgent youth in New England, sails to Africa to serve as surgeon on board an American slave ship. The scene of chained slaves transported on board the ship filled him with sympathy and sadness. He was further pained to know that by virtue of his profession, he was consolidating the slavery system he so vehemently disliked. Quote from the novel: "The damned sorrow of some, the frenzy of others, the sobbings and tears of the children and shrieks of the women when they were presented to our captain so affected me that I was hastening from this scene of barbarity on board the ship, when I was called by the mate and discovered to my surprise and horror that by my station in the ship I had a principal and active part of this inhuman transaction imposed upon me." End of quote. The irony is further intensified when he himself is captured by Algerian corsairs and condemned to a life of toil and deprivation. But Tyler's character refuses to submit and forces his captors to recognize his worth when he put his medical skills to service. It was in the capacity of doctor that he was allowed to accompany Algerian pilgrims to Mecca and Medina, which sacred places are brought so close and vivid to the reader. Tyler's novel makes an extensive use of historical records and introduces a rather complex image of Islam, both as a doctrine and a cultural practice. The most compelling part of the narrative concerns the theological discussion which Tyler's character has with an imam, very much in the style of Plato's dialogues. Through the dynamic personality of his character, Tyler succeeds in delving deep in the social and cultural fabric of the Algerian society and rendering it in plain and rather familiar terms. There is little in contemporary historical scholarship to match the rich symbolism, wit, and humanism of these texts. While Rawson's and Tyler's investment of the Barbary frontier is governed by an assertive policy interspersed with cultural bias, it is ultimately the universal ideas of justice, freedom, and equality to which they make appeal. Algiers furnished the symbolic space of alterity onto which were projected domestic images of racial and sexual discrimination. It is this powerful evocative ambivalence that seems to be lost on this new generation of American historians. The long and complex process of U.S. rise to power is reduced to flat notions of American exceptionalism and invincibility. Reading contemporary accounts of American encounters with Algiers and Tripoli, one is struck by the exceeding linearity and simplicity of the narratives. And I have a book that I want to use. There's so many books actually, but if I have time, maybe in the discussion, I could just read one simple passage from there. It must be acknowledged rather than the Algiers episode, which had involved no military engagement, it was the Tripoli affair that supplied the dramatic detail and sensational effect for these historians. In early 1801, the Pasha of Tripoli, hoping to exert influence on the American government to conclude a new treaty on favorable terms, declared war on American ships. This turn of events coincided with a new president, Thomas Jefferson, taking office. Jefferson had already experienced the difficulty of handling American interest in this part of the Mediterranean when he was Secretary of State during George Washington's first term. But the margin of maneuver he had now was bigger. America had emerged stronger from its naval encounter with France and possessed a sizable navy ready to deploy in the Mediterranean, partly to protect American shipping and partly to convince the Pasha of Tripoli to come to terms. Jefferson ordered a squadron of 4 frigates and a schooner to intercept Tripolitan vessels. Thus, for 2 years, the American squadron, at a high cost and a doubtful efficiency, convoyed merchant ships and occasionally blockaded the port of Tripoli without making much progress. In October 1803, things took a different turn when the ship Philadelphia ran aground on a reef at Tripoli. Believing the situation to be hopeless, Captain Bainbridge, who commanded the ship, decided to surrender both ship and the 306 men who made up the crew. This new development made the Pasha more adamant in his demands. In reprisal, the American squadron captured a few Tripolitan vessels and held about 60 of their crew hostage. But this was a minor compensation. A bold and successful attempt to destroy the Philadelphia in the harbor of Tripoli helped to boost American morale. Now it was the fate of the captured Marines and the prestige of America that needed to be restored. To maintain maximum pressure on the Pasha, Jefferson consented to an adventurous plan advanced by William Eaton. And William Eaton was a soldier, and later he became a consul in Tunis. And he concocted that plan that I'm going to mention in a minute, and convinced Jefferson of to give his approval. Eaton's plan involved supporting the Pasha's brother, who was a refugee in Egypt, to regain power in Tripoli. In exchange of American support, the Pasha's brother was willing to grant American demand and sign a durable peace treaty with the United States. The story of how the American government attempted to topple the Pasha of Tripoli is captivating as well. There are a lot of interesting stories, and that probably explains why some recent non-academic writers get interested in writing these kind of narratives. Eaton's expedition across the eastern deserts of Libya at the head of an army of tribesmen had been the object of many historical narratives. It ultimately led to the occupation of the town of Derna on the eastern side, some 800 miles east of Tripoli. The capture of Derna was a spectacular gesture that tipped the balance in favor of the American negotiators. From $400,000, which the Pasha demanded prior to Eaton's expedition, he now settled to the humble sum of $60,000 as ransom for American captives, and he agreed to withdraw any future claims for a tribute. Meanwhile, American promises made to the Pasha's brother evaporated upon the signing of the new peace treaty. He was evacuated from Derna to Livorno and left to grapple in bitterness with his own financial problems. This is in brief the historical context of the American war with Tripoli. In 1815, in response to Algiers' declaration of war 3 years earlier, the government once more sent a large squadron under Captain Stephen Decatur. This proved to be a tour de force. Decatur's superior naval power convinced the weak and decadent government of Algiers to acquiesce to American demands. In the following year, Algiers was heavily bombarded by a British squadron commanded by Lord Exmouth. This signaled the beginning of Algiers' decline and foreshadowed its quick fall and occupation by the French forces in 1830. Few of my countrymen today know anything about past naval contest with the United States. History books in Morocco, for instance, make little or no mention of the subject. After all, this was only one belated phase of a long history of maritime conflict with non-Muslim states dating back to the medieval times. In the United States, however, the story of the Barbary Wars has never lost its lure or appeal. The impressive volume of writing devoted to this early episode of American history is a clear proof of this unfading interest. Drawing on American sources, historians have uncovered significant details about the various aspects of American diplomatic and naval activity related to the so-called Barbary states. Several biographical accounts have been written about the major figures involved in this war, such as Thomas Jefferson, William Eaton, Joel Barlow, Stephen Decatur, emphasizing their sense of patriotism and their heroic actions. Much of the appeal that American historians have felt for this early phase emanates from the belief that far from being imperial crusades against less powerful nations, those remote and unusual naval contests which the United States fought against Tripoli 1801-1805 and Algiers 1816 were conducted in the spirit of legitimate defense and in reprisal of damage sustained from the depredation of the Barbary corsairs. That the United States emerged victorious from these encounters, we're told, was an extraordinary achievement given the nation's political and economic difficulties in the aftermath of the War of Independence. The turbulent relations with the Barbary states, it is argued, had brought Americans together and render the idea of powerful federal government and national navy less detestable. These nostalgic reconstructions of the encounter with the Barbary states rarely gave any credit to North Africans. Like many 19th century European historians, American scholars of the 20th century, such Alan Gardner, Louis Wright, Julia MacLeod, Henry Custer, and Paul Bamford, to cite only a few, subscribed to the view, poorly documented, that North Africans were unable or unwilling to develop stable economies, engage in commercial activities, and substitute piratical actions and harassment of international trade with peaceful relations with the rest of the civilized world. A more recent radical tendency in American historical discourse on Barbary gained immediate impetus and popularity in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks of September 11. Amid the universal trauma and perplexity at the magnitude of the attacks, several writers seized the opportune moment to draw public attention to what they believed a precedent of current tragic incident. In an essay published in the National Review online under the title America's Earliest Terrorists, Joshua London states, quote, "At the dawn of a new century, a newly elected United States president was forced to confront a grave threat to the nation, an escalating series of unprovoked attacks on America by Muslim terrorists. Worse still, these Islamic partisans operated under the protection and sponsorship of rogue Arab states ruled by ruthless and cunning dictators." Makes me laugh. You know, this is not an incident or an isolated case. This is part of, a fluid discourse. It was this apocalyptic vision of the past that the author endeavored to reveal in greater dramatic detail in a book titled Victory in Tripoli. So he, as it says in a different context, he bloated the essay into a book called Victory in Tripoli. Like many other accounts which came out in that historic moment, carrying bombastic and eye-catching titles, London's book failed to rise above the rhetoric of vilification and negation and recited with typical indiscrimination statements that are entirely untenable and have little or no archival evidence to justify them. Islam and terrorism, for instance, are represented as bound up in a symbiotic relation that no lapse of time or change of circumstance can affect. It is further asserted that Muslim conduct towards Christians constituted a pattern of intolerance and violence rooted in the culture and history of Muslim nations. If any lessons are to be drawn, the early example of America's naval war against its enemies was an edifying and noble undertaking in the name of the values to which the fathers of the American nations were committed. Another illustration of this new unbridled discourse of chauvinism is given expression in Joseph Willen's book, Jeffersons War, America's First War on Terror, 1801-1805. His book's abstract sums up the gist of his narrative. He says, 2 centuries ago, without congressional or public debate, a president whom we think of today as peaceable, Thomas Jefferson, launched America's first war on foreign soil, a war against terror. The enemy was Muslim. The war was waged unconventionally with commandos, native troops, encrypted intelligence, and launched from foreign base under short-term alliances. Willen's description obviously referred to American war with Tripoli. Save for Jefferson's name, there is nothing that reflects the particularity of this encounter. Rather than the Pasha of Tripoli, the enemy is identified as Muslim. The precise circumstances of this conflict are turned into fixed, timeless patterns. The immediate goal of the war is manifold: extortion, plunder, terror. While this abstraction might point to a lack of understanding of the complex context and background of the war, they also reveal a tendency to construct a conflict in terms of binary oppositions of good versus evil. Willen forgets that during those 2 centuries, slavery was a global and institutionalized practice in full swing across the Atlantic. And besides thousands of Europeans, there were millions of Africans who were condemned to confront the grim realities of servitude, dispossession, and denigration. It would be ridiculous to blame these dehumanizing attitudes and policies on religious principles. They were the immoral expression of a new stage of transnational economic growth. Only recently, historians begin to acknowledge that North Africans themselves were enslaved by Europeans and forced to man the galleys in Cadiz, Marseille, and Livorno. Records of their miseries as oarsmen had yet to be unearthed and brought under scrutiny. The flurry of enthusiasm and inflammatory rhetoric has not passed yet. A stream of publication, newspaper articles, and online postings continue to emphasize the discursive link between former Corsairs' activities and recent incidents. As Richard Parker has warned in his learned study, Uncle Sam in Barbary, he says, the details of what happened in and the nature of American response 2 centuries ago are poorly understood by writers and their readers or listeners today. While this ignorance of history might not seem catastrophic, the misunderstandings of decision makers about what they see as precedent that have been sanctified by time and experience can have fateful consequences for Americans today. Basing a response to today's terrorism on an imagined response to the Barbary Corsairs 2 centuries ago does not make a great deal of sense. End of quote. As an experienced diplomat and expert on North African affairs, having served as U.S. ambassador in Algeria and Morocco during the Ford and Carter administrations, Parker, the author, has been unequivocal in his criticism of this wave of historical writing. His account is informed by a desire to explain the complex formation of North African cultures. The Barbary Wars, he argues, were commercial wars in principle that had acquired complicated diplomatic and political dimensions. Without international trade agreements or recognized maritime codes, the commercial interests and policies of each nation were deemed to be better served by gunboat diplomacy. The ethical discourse had no place in this uncharted sphere of international maritime activity. As Frank Lambert, another interesting scholar, argues in a recent book, quote, the Barbary Wars were primarily about trade, not theology, and rather than being holy wars, they were an extension of America's war of independence, end of quote. Let me conclude with a brief and optimistic note. American historiography on North Africa is vast and complex. While the full truths of this past conflict are irretrievably lost, it is through the archives that one can penetrate into the recesses of history to gain an approximate view of what may have taken place. These acts of excavation are always fraught with multiple risks, prime among which is the tendency to read the past from the vantage point of the present and impose on past actuality coercive and straitjacketed interpretation in order to serve posterior ideological goals. Despite the relative remoteness of past events like U.S.-North African conflicts, it is possible for us, as scholars, to reconstruct solid and documented narratives. Although for methodological reasons, it would say it might have chosen to overlook the North African region and focus his critique of Orientalism on the Middle East proper, the relevance of his discursive method to European American scholarship on the so-called Barbary region is strong and valid. Like Said, I believe that a contrapuntal reading, which is a strategy he develops in his book Culture and Imperialism, which is a reaction to the criticism he got on Orientalism, that he was constructing the other, the Orient, as silent. He tries to come up with, a different vision of a certain dynamic relation between self and the other, between the West and the Orient. And he called that the contrapunto. And he, in relation to Culture and Imperialism, which is more about literary texts and theories, he would compare a colonial text, a metropolitan text, with a text from a colony. And so he would, for example, compare Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness to Taib Salah Muslim, Season of Migration to the North, and see both as part of one dynamic. So I think that method, if appropriated to history, it would also be interesting. And I can expand on that if we have time for it. Like Said, I believe that a contrapunto reading of the Barbary Wars based on American and North African records and rising above the ideological squabbles is our best alternative for cosmopolitan, humanistic, and cross-cultural understanding. Thank you. Thank you.
So will you take some questions?
Of course.
Okay.
More a comment than a question. I
Yeah.
agree with you that that's not an isolated historical event, but it's part of our daily life. I wish I listened to your talk last week because I was doing a talk in Florida 2 days ago. Then some activists, I think I gotta call them activists, tried to make an announcement to print out, not saying that my talk was on the impact of oil on the but the declaration was about the American war with Muslims in Tripoli in 1790s. And then he was reading how Americans tried to get the peaceful relations, whereas the other side say, no, the Quran ordered us to kill the infidels. Then I was so shocked and surprised. And they said, what kind of nonsense was that? If I had listened to you, I would have understood that something going on. I wouldn't be so surprised. So the second thing is that in the debate on secularism in the United States, the best documents the liberals or separationists have is the Treaty of Tripoli, 1791, unanimously ratified by the Senate. The Article 11 of the treaty is saying that the United States has no hostility with Muslims because it is by no means as a Christian nation.
Okay.
It's a document that shows that the United States was not funded as a Christian nation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember having read something about that, and that Jefferson also used the Quran to understand various laws of nations, and that he did not have the traditional attitude which some Europeans, not all Europeans, some Europeans had in their understanding of the relations with the Muslim world, with the land of the Muslims.
One last point, when the first Muslim congressperson was elected, he used Jefferson's copy.
Right. Yeah. Yes.
What kinds of records are there? Do you have any idea yet? You may not know yet.
Right.
Because you may not have gone. And I would assume that you would have some
Definitely.
Ottoman records, perhaps. But
Definitely.
I don't know what kind of records you're going to
Right.
have other than that.
Well, first of all, there are sources and records that some of the American historians, quote unquote, are not using. And these records, yes, and they are here, and I was happy to collect them here. They're published in 1939, and a group of naval historians got all those correspondence, letters, reports published in 6 volumes. Now, many of the historians, when I look through their bibliographies, they don't even use those basic and fundamental sources. They would quote from one another and use newspaper articles and use journals, and that's it. So first, we need to use what sources we have here. And then, I'm sure there are other sources, but then the technology does not help much. And I think an ideal history of the Barbary Wars should use both archives and try to write a kind of neutral narrative, not because that's the problem. That's, you know, since I started working on this and the other project, that's my problem. You are always writing within a tradition. So, for example, the case of the other project on British occupation of Tangier, 17th century, all the major accounts written by British historians, you know, try to defend British perspective on how it was important for the British to occupy Tangier and how those savages kicked us out of that country. And if you look at Moroccan sources, they would consider that as, you know, jihad against the infidel for encroaching upon our lands, etc., etc. And I think a scholar has to move away from those ideological positions and try to address documents as they are, not because there is a truth that he or she can present eventually, but a more credible, more solid, more critical, more interesting, more intriguing narrative than the kind of naive narratives we have. So there are difficulties in finding other sources, but you ask me in a couple of years' time, I can give you a more. Yeah. Yes.
That must mean you're coming back.
We're staying.
We'll go there.
Right. Yeah.
At the end, you mentioned that these maybe basically and ultimately were trade wars.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, in the documents, or at the time, contemporary time of late 18th century and into the 19th century, what were the charges that were made against the American vessels? That they were in Algerian or Straits, territorial waters, that they were...
Right. Well, when we look at the history...
And my other side, of course, is...
Go ahead.
I assume America was using the same charges against people who are coming up against Philadelphia, against
right.
Boston,
Definitely.
There may have been a...
Well, you think of the Navy Acts in the 17th century between Britain and the Netherlands and the Anglo-Dutch War. They're all based on, protecting their own trade, and how that intrigued wars afterwards between the U.S. and Britain. In the first place, it was a trade war, not a war on other principles. Maybe it took that dimension afterwards, but it was basically because they thought that they were treated unfairly by the British. So we tend to diminish the importance of the commercial dimension, and it's the most important. I mean, lots of European historians, distinguished European historians like Fernand Braudel, who forgets about these differences, cultural differences that have been emphasized in recent years, and talks about the Mediterranean as one area that have so many connections that are much more important than the religious or cultural dimensions. That the wars were waged between states on the basis of economic interest. And in my readings in the 17th century, which I'm a little bit familiar with, having written an essay on Dutch presence in the Mediterranean in the 17th century, they were ready to conclude treaties with Algiers and Morocco against Spain, just as in the end of the 16th century, Morocco had extensive relations with England against Spain. And so the position kept changing, not on the ground of one fixed position like religion, but on other factors like exactly. And the Europeans themselves, I mean, I'm reading a lot on Charles II Restoration period and how he kept changing his position. One time he's with French. Most of the time he was. And then he would wage war against the Netherlands. And then if he was convinced otherwise that he would get more money, he would change his attitude and side with another. So when you look at that development along European history in the last 300 years, you begin to understand that these wars were also part of that dynamic, that they were based on economic interests. And for North Africa, we have to remember that, yes, there was no extensive trade, agriculture, whatever, and they were dependent on the sea. They were maritime powers since antiquity. But by the beginning of the 17th century, late 16th century and 17th century, with northern powers begin to invade the Mediterranean with large ships and introducing new products and diminishing the importance of the Levant trade during the medieval times, finding other ways to go to the Far East and from East and West. The importance of the Mediterranean itself, became an issue. And for North Africans, they had less and less sources of maintaining themselves as a state. Plus that there were new types of ships that were built. And so they simply dominated the trade. And for North Africans, they developed that strategy of imposing treaties on those powers so that they can at least protect. And the thing is, France protected Algiers for so many centuries because they found an interest in pushing other powers from the Mediterranean. And they had Algiers as their black market. And they would bring everything to Algiers and sell it because they can do that with other powers because they have other treaties. So it's a complicated affair. When one perspective is focused on at the expense of other perspectives, then we get a kind of blurred image of what happened.
So I wanted to ask you to elaborate on two things. One is the Contrapunto reading, and you talked about that just a little bit a few moments ago, but if you could elaborate on that some more. And then also I was intrigued by this idea of the Barbary Wars being an extension of the American War of Independence. I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Well, let me start with that second point. Some of these historians argue that America would not have been an international power. Up to the beginning of the 19th century, America was trying to come to terms with its own problems, basically economic problems, but also constitutional problems because the 13 states were not capable of coming together. They were always jealous of one another, territorial disputes, also contributing to a federal government. So they were not in a position really to impose their interest on the other nations. But the conflict with North Africa accelerated that process. And when Algiers and Tripoli had so many captives, they decided then that they would build a naval force. And it was their victories against Tripoli and Algiers that gave them that sense of pride and power that they were afterwards considered as a power to contend with. So they would consider that whole process as leading to their independence or the completion of their independence. The other point about Contrapunto, I think this is one concept that hasn't been developed fully. And I find it the alternative. Although I have so many criticisms of Said, but I think that his concept of the contrapunto is very important. He's considered a humanist, etc. But the concept of contrapunto, as I said, allows us to become cosmopolitan scholars and rise above national, religious, political boundaries. And for the first time, talk about the whole history of mankind, or specific parts of it, from a critical, he used this term critical perspective, and he always advocated the notion of critical consciousness. And in practical terms, what that means, it's becoming more sophisticated, more critical, more intelligent in our intellectual pursuit. And in that sense, if I'm going to write, hopefully, a study on American historiography, it would be easy for me. I would be easily tempted to counter all those arguments by taking the other perspective and trying to find contradictions in the argument, and I could easily write that narrative. It's not a big deal. I mean, I mentioned that I could read you a passage. I could just rip that passage off, because it doesn't make much sense. But this is only going to, continue that debate endlessly. But the more interesting perspective is to try to bring two perspectives, conflicting perspective together, and try to understand beyond my Moroccan, Arab, Muslim, whatever identity, and try to address those issues. I think Said spent his life rooted and based, and probably you might say he was insulated from the rest of the world, which he defended on. But he was always recommending and praising the university as a space where you can develop intelligent ideas and where you can reach out to other individuals with different convictions and different perceptions. So I think this is what I hope I've clarified that a little bit.
I'd like to hear more on how you would use that approach regarding this particular subject matter, and I don't know if that's a question for a couple of years down the line also.
Right. Well, what I can say at this stage is I am willing to look into not only the sources that I have accumulated and the rest that I'm hoping to get, but also to look at North African sources and to try to be faithful in reflecting the arguments without judging those arguments, and eventually try to present a complex image of that period. That's how I'm trying to, without identifying myself with one or the other perspective. So bringing these together, it would be very challenging. I'm sure so many people would prefer not to try that because, and even then, you are somewhere on one side or the other. It's not 100% neutral.
Unbeknownst to me.
No objectivity.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's relative neutrality rather than objectivity.
But do you have a sense of what types of texts these would be? I mean, presumably they're not going to be fiction. And archives, sends us suggesting, and that maybe in a few years if you dig up some archive. And I'm actually having a hard time imagining what types of texts one would find.
Where?
North African texts.
Okay. Well, yeah. They have what they call taqaid. Taqaid are like logbooks. Because they have to report, they have to document events at some point because they have to provide information to the authorities. So they have those. But the problem is how to get access to them. And of course, there are a number of North African historians that, old historians, talking about 19th century historians, who wrote about these things. And sometimes you can see easily the kind of perspective that develop in that it is a kind of jihad. And I know that this term has been corrupted. You hear Bin Laden's repeating the same statement, jihad, but it's much more complex then. The world was much more flat than it is today. Today it's not as simple as it was, but at that time there was us and them, and that's it. So you can see that discourse there. I don't know how to deal with that at this stage, but I still need to, and then compare between episodes and between discourse, because I know, for example, that Spain was hated so much by North Africans. There was no discussion. I mean, there were always moments of coming to terms with other powers, the French, the Dutch, the British, but the Spanish were so much hated that the discourse is a discourse of rejection. But it differs from one period in history and from one type of relation to another.
But was there a question about the discipline that your book may be categorized in, or the discipline
about
the
sources?
Okay.
I was asking about the sources.
Then can I ask about your book?
Well,
literature book or?
Well, I found a book in the library and I was surprised. It's called, what is it? A strange name that combines literature and history. It's not even ethnohistory. And I was reading parts of it, and now this fusion of disciplines is much more interesting than writing from one particular perspective. So I would, locate myself on the boundary between literature and history.
Sorry, it sounds much more like you're fully within the realm of history than you might think.
Right. Right.
But it's in the literature as well. I mean,
yes,
right.
Very
I mean,
right.
it's a cultural studies approach.
Okay.
It's pretty,
Yeah.
Regarding sources, though, couldn't your maritime captains be a legitimate source? Not hearsay?
A captain?
Maritime captains.
Right. Well, not many of them wrote their narratives. They would be considered autobiographies, personal narratives. And so they're true and valid in terms of their relation to the person writing. But no text is beyond questioning. All the
is innocent.
yeah,
there
exactly.
Are no innocent.
Right. All text.
His personal perspective.
Right. Well, I think the personal perspective is very important.